Listen closely. There's a story buried under the soil of this continent, a story that doesn't often make the history books. It's a story of survival, of resistance, of people who refuse to disappear. It begins in the swamps. In the thick, humid silence of the American South, runaway slaves, men and women who had risked everything to escape the plantations, found themselves here, standing ankle-deep in mud, hearts pounding, breath fogging in the early morning air. Behind them, chains, whips, overseers, ahead of them, a vast wilderness. And in that wilderness, they met others. Native American tribes, Seminoles, Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, had been living on this land for centuries. They had their own wars, their own grief, their own memory of European colonization. Dr. Elena Roberts, a historian who studies African and Native history, puts it simply. These were two groups who had both been displaced, both been targeted by European settlers, and they found common cause. They recognized each other as allies. Imagine that moment. The fear in the runaways' eyes. The quiet calculation in the faces of the tribe. Two worlds both under siege, staring at each other across a fire, and then a nod, an understanding. What happened next was more than just an alliance. It was the birth of something new. Over time, these communities mixed. African blood and native blood. African language and native language. African drums and native chants. They built villages together. Fished and hunted together. Some intermarried, raising children whose skin carried the memory of both peoples. And this terrified the colonies. In 1738, Spain established Fort Mose, just north of St. Augustine, Florida, the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what is now the United States. It became a magnet for escapees from British plantations. Seminole villages became magnets too. Colonial governors wrote in panic about what might happen if slaves learned they could escape, and not just escape, but find sanctuary. So militias were sent to destroy these communities. Florida became a flashpoint. The Seminoles, in particular, became famous for protecting escaped slaves. Together, they fought back against American troops, against slave catchers, against everything that threatened their fragile freedom. This alliance became known as the Black Seminoles, and they were feared. In a report from 1818, General Edmund Gaines described their tactics. They lie in wait like shadows, strike without warning, and vanish into the hammocks before the smoke clears. They were ghost warriors, fighting a guerrilla war decades before that term even existed. But America was relentless. As the young nation expanded westward, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, forcing native tribes off their ancestral lands in what became known as the Trail of Tears. The Black Seminoles were forced out too. Some were captured and re-enslaved. Others escaped again, this time heading deeper into Florida or across the border into Mexico. Yes, Mexico. Because in 1829, Mexico abolished slavery and they welcomed these runaways as free men. In northern Mexico, the Black Seminoles built new lives. Some became scouts for the Mexican army, defending remote settlements. Decades later, many crossed back into the United States, hired by the very U.S. Army that once tried to wipe them out. Historian Kevin Mulroy, author of Freedom on the Border, writes, "It is one of history's great ironies that the United States, which had once tried to destroy the Black Seminoles, later depended on them as some of the most effective frontier soldiers. And yet, despite all of this, their story is barely mentioned in American classrooms." Ask most people about African Americans, and they'll tell you about the Middle Passage, about slavery, about the civil rights movement. Ask them about Native Americans, and they'll tell you about teepees and reservations and cowboys and Indians. But this story, this merging of two oppressed peoples into something fiercely defiant, rarely makes the cut. And maybe that's why it matters so much. Because when you trace the roots of African Native American history, you're not just looking at survival. You're looking at creativity, resistance, the refusal to let empire decide who you are. Today, there are still descendants of these unions. Some live in Oklahoma, some in Texas, some in Mexico. They carry surnames passed down from both African and Native ancestors. Their faces, their traditions, their songs are living archives of a history that was almost erased. And when they tell their story, you can hear the pride and the pain. A descendant interviewed in the PBS documentary Black Indians, An American Story, put it this way: "Our ancestors didn't just run from something. They ran toward something. They ran toward freedom. And they found it together. That's the part that stays with me. History likes to divide people into neat categories. Black, Native, white. The real story of America is messy. It's filled with hidden alliances, unexpected friendships, and quiet acts of rebellion that changed everything. So next time you walk through the South, through the swamps, through the pine forests, through the lands that were once Seminole territory, listen carefully. You might hear them. The echoes of drums and footsteps. The sound of people who refuse to be broken, because they are still here. And so is their story.